In our study so far of the chapter titled Oneness in Sri Aurobindo's Synthesis of Yoga, Sri Aurobindo has described how the upper half of the cosmos reflects into the lower half, and this stage of the yoga is meant to link all the powers which are above to their equivalent powers below in our normal human consciousness. And for this purpose, he described how we have to review and remold the lower living in the light, force and joy of the higher reality. Matter itself we have to see as a mold for the spirit and a vehicle for the manifestation of this light, force and joy of the Satchidananda. Life itself is a channel for the infinite force of the divine that, as it pours into us, is able to liberate this limited life energy that we have and become a representation of the blissful conscious force of the Satchidananda. And similarly, our mental life, our sensational and emotional mentality have to become a base for the play of the divine love and universal delight, and our intellect to be filled with the divine light and to become a vehicle of the divine knowledge will. Until all of this, which is our present life and working, grows into the likeness of the divine nature and is raised and transformed into to become its instrument. This process we have dwelt upon in some detail, looking at all the nuances of what he describes, catching in a few phrases sometimes various stages and degrees of this transformation. But now Sri Aurobindo comes to a favorite theme which we find repeated throughout his writings. The challenge of this transition, in particular because of the difference between the mind and the divine consciousness. The limitations of mind which prevent this from happening, but at the same time those very limitations are the means by which this can happen. And so we come back to that theme, but each time from a different perspective, and this time from the perspective of this transformation. And you will see how beautifully he brings all the threads of our life and of our being into one complex unity. So first he reminds us that by itself the mind is incapable of making the full transition. It needs something more. This transformation cannot be complete or really executed without the awakening of the truth mind, which corresponds in the mental being to the supermind and is capable of receiving mentally its illuminations. We dwelt upon this last time as a preparation for our discussion today, so it's worth reviewing because this is one of the most important ideas which makes possible the divinization of life, but also which is the promise that one way or other this life will be divinized. Because already within our mind there is something which corresponds to that divine as a principle, as an operative power. And if it is there already within us, then it has to grow in time, in the evolution. And as it grows, what will it do? It will begin to actualize those higher possibilities right here within the mind. Its existence, its presence is the promise that our mind will be divinized. The question is only now, of the path, the process, and the time it takes. And let's explore this relationship a little bit by looking at similar relationships that belong to our human and animal experience. If you observe a dog, if you have had a pet dog or a pet cat or any other pet animal which is sufficiently mentalized that you can even feel that they are trying to think. Monkeys in particular, mother used to appreciate them. She had brought, among the few things that she brought from France and from Japan with her, she left behind most of her things there, saying goodbye to them once and for all, knowing that she would not go back. But among the few things she brought back were a series of paintings of monkeys. And she commented about this, saying that she found it more interesting to observe monkeys than humans, because in the monkey consciousness, they sense the possibility of the human intellect and the human mind. They feel it close and are struggling and aspiring to somehow catch that thing which they feel possible. Whereas in human beings, there is not that enthusiasm or that aspiration or that struggle to grow. And that is what she was always attracted to. Even in people she met, wherever the aspiration was strong, that for her was the most important thing. Because finally, in the very nature of the yoga, it is that aspiration which is your promise as well as your means for the evolution. So, taking the example of a monkey or a dog or whatever pet you have had, when you observe in their behavior, they are challenged. They struggle to understand, almost as if trying to think what to do. And you see that movement, you realize actually within them there is this capacity for rationality. You notice it being activated, but only when they are challenged. And you can be sure that this creature will grow into a thinking form. Now, whether it can do it within its physical lifetime, dogs typically, they say, live for about 10 years. Can it manage that kind of growth in 10 years? Perhaps a little bit of it. But if the same dog could live for 100 years, for sure, it would develop into the same power of human thought. But its biology may not support more than a certain amount, especially in the power of speech. The biology may not have the capacity. But the consciousness is able to push to that limit. On very rare occasions, we meet these kinds of beings. I recall one which was extraordinary. It was in the United States. I was visiting somebody's house, and we were sitting in a comfortable space. And then suddenly, somebody walked into the room, looked at us, and then walked out. Except it was not a human being. It was their pet dog. This dog walked like a completely conscious person with the highest sense of aesthetics and self-awareness of its artistic sense of walk. It walked like this consciously, turned, looked, and made direct contact, eye to eye, gaze, and you knew it was a mature person. And then she turned away and walked out. And that was it. And it was such a shock to see a human consciousness. And so afterwards, we went and tried to make contact with the dog, but she was very shy. She refused to make contact. She was a little afraid. Maybe it takes time to build trust with human beings, especially when you're so conscious or refined. But you know this is somebody who's ready for a human birth. That kind of possibility exists already in the dog species consciousness, because the principle of the rational mind is there embedded. If the principle is embedded, the rest of the journey is possible. Go back one step before the dogs, in animals which are much more instinctive, less conscious, and you will find there the capacity to become conscious embedded as a capacity, as a principle. You go back further to the levels of, let's say, a worm, where there is not even an emotional consciousness developed. And you'll find in the worm the instinct or the potential of an emotional bond, in principle, available. Now, at that point, you can speak of the rational mind, but it would have to go through at least 2 or 3 steps of development before it can link directly with the rational mind. But through those 2 or 3 steps, the power of rationality reflects in the worm's working. If you observe how a worm moves around, there is a kind of a logic, but the logic is, because it's through several levels of reflection, it's a bit confused, it's a bit mixed. Observe how an ant, for example, wanders around the floor, zip, 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 zip. It's not obvious that there is a logic. It seems to go back over the same patches and zigzag for no reason at all, or so it seems to us. To the ant itself, there might be something, the senses, oh, a smell, the smell is gone. What about this side? And it may be doing some kind of a process that we are not aware of. But if you watch that zigzag movement of the ant for a while, you will notice it's as if it covers the entire space with an equal distribution of chance. And if you drop a grain of sugar and the ant finds it, from the moment it finds it, it goes straight towards its nest. Amazing. While it was zigzagging apparently irrationally, it was covering the full space. The moment it got what it wanted, it knew how to get back. So it was never lost. To its consciousness, it was never random. But to us, it seems somewhat random. The same search, if we had to do with an airplane or a ship, we would go in a pattern like this, zigzagging across, knowing exactly what is the distance that we can see and slightly overlapping as we go in our normal zigzag. That would be a mental search, highly efficient. But when that mentality is reflected one level down, but the principle is there, you still get something which has a strong mental component, but covered by a more instinctive, passionate, zigzagging impulse. Now, in the earlier stage of human evolution, before a large part of humanity had come into self-conscious rational mind, we were still largely impulsive beings. As human beings, we were driven by passions much more than by thought. The power of thinking and rationality was subjugated to the drive of the passion. And this is what we would call the barbarian. So in that barbaric stage of humanity, rationality was present, but had not come into its own. The human being was unable to say, I think, therefore I shall do as I think. It was rather, I want, therefore let me work out how to make my want actualize. At that point, you could have spoken of the power of the rationality leading. It'll seem like, not very interesting. What's life without passion? What's life without excitement? What's life without the drive? You are going to think of what you want to do and then follow your thought. Not interesting. That's how the person would say. If at that point you spoke of a power higher than mind and the possibility of opening to that, for it to lead, okay, after my retirement, another lifetime, it's not at all interesting. But having come into self-aware rationality, having played with its possibilities, having organized your life as far as you could with your mind, with your rationality and reason, and then felt the insufficiency, your reason now turns to, what can I do to overcome this lack? I came so far thinking I would get it, whatever the it is, and still it's slipping through. What more can I do? And now it wants to search, it wants to find a greater power. And this is where the conscious spiritual journey can begin. The moment this upward turn has taken place, you can be sure the rest of the journey will follow. But if at that point the upward turn is only begun, There'll be stages, steps where you will reach and you'll say, now this is good enough. Perhaps there can be more, but I'm quite content. So a series of stages of contentment are typically how the mass of humanity evolves through. But each of these steps is possible because something of that higher possibility is already there, waiting. When the lower drivers are exhausted, or when they have become insufficient, then we tend to activate or reach out to the next. Or the next becomes strong enough to override the lower, and a transition takes place. Now, exactly the same process is happening from here where we are to the next. There is this power of the truth mind, corresponding in the mental being to the supermind. Because it is there, our reason is able to sense things which bypass logic. So, somebody is narrating a story, and as you listen, something in the story rings true. That's the way we describe it. It rings true. It's like a bell. If you strike it, it resonates a pure note, or there's a crack inside and the pure resonance is somehow broken. That fine sense is what you feel in a person's narration, and you can feel there's something exaggerated here, something not quite, it doesn't ring true. It's like there's that little crack. That sensitivity, that direct perception of true or not true, is precisely the working of this truth mind in us. But it is working at a level or behind the screen of your conscious, rational mind. So you feel something, you sense it, and then your reason jumps up to justify it. Probably he is exaggerating because of this reason, or perhaps this part is exaggerated, that part is true. Your mind is agitated, trying to make sense of it. But the driver of your reason, the one who directed the reason to the direction of what is true or what is not, was this truth mind. And here's the interesting thing. In the journey of life, the more our normal reason learns to refer to the truth mind for the indications, the more it finds that it gets it. Now we've all, in our childhood at least, read stories of mystery. Sherlock Holmes was one of those, as children perhaps you have heard of, read of. And one of the things which you admire when you hear these stories is, this fellow is somehow able to seize on what is true and go straight to it. How does he do it? And in fact, there are people like that in every field of life who are able to go straight, while the rest of us keep wandering around trying to figure out what's happening. And it is this power. And it's light, so to say, beam pointing here. You have a laser pointer, you point there, and the dog runs after the spot. Literally the same thing happening inside us. Something which is not part of our conscious self-awareness points, and we run after it. After a while you realize you can set up a relationship with it. And one of the things which you're even taught, sleep over it. You have a problem, you can't solve it. You've tried every possible solution, and then they say, sleep over it. And that means you go to sleep, you wake up, and you have the solution. What happened in between during the sleep? So the rational mind will answer this question by saying, well, your mind continued to think until it found the answer, and then when you woke up, you had it. Not quite so, because in the sleep you were not thinking, you were not conscious. And if it was just a question of time, you would have found it in your own thinking. Something else happened. In fact, during the sleep, your conscious mind stopped working. And it gave a chance for this other faculty behind to put out its light, its laser pointer, its indication. Here's the solution. And you woke up with that indication. Many fields today, people are coming to recognize this principle, this truth, and are consciously trying to build relationships with this part of the knowledge. Whatever name you give to it, intuition is one of its forms. But intuition is only its most superficial form. Behind intuition is its freer and larger working, and it is to that Sri Aurobindo points when he uses the word truth mind, truth-mind. Now, Sri Aurobindo often uses terms like this, two words with a hyphen in between. Chit Shakti, consciousness force or conscious force, truth mind in this case. Physical vital, physical mind. Always when you have two words with a hyphen, it means the first as the second. So, if you say conscious force, it's consciousness as force. Truth mind is truth operating as mind or in mind. Physical mind is the physical consciousness working inside the domain of mind. Mental physical is the mental consciousness working in the physical body. So truth mind is truth working as mind. The power of truth being the power that already knows, which already is, that is reflected in the working of mind as a domain, as a principle. And so the awakening of the truth mind is what can complete this transformation which we have been discussing. If this is not there, if this truth mind is not active, it does not come into as the link point, then this transformation can only go so far, after which we can't seem to proceed. Why? Sri Aurobindo explains that the very nature of mind is a kind of a spiraling movement, but it can go only up to its domain, and its domain is one of division, pieces. So spirals until it reaches the limit of what it can manage in pieces, and then keeps going round and round, but it can't go up anymore. What is above has to now touch and connect. And this is the truth mind. Corresponds in the mental being to the supermind, and is capable of receiving mentally its illuminations. So within our mental being, many higher faculties or powers have their representation. The intellect itself is in fact the reflection of the truth mind in the surface sensory working of the mind. But the truth mind itself as a principle is there behind the intellect. It, in the intellect, tells the intellect that you found your answer. Think about this. This is a problem we have in computers, and we try to recreate human intelligence. Given a problem, how will the intelligence know where to start looking for a solution? How will it know if it has come close to the solution or is farther from the solution? Otherwise it will keep on looking haphazardly. Like a dog, it has to sniff out, now I am close, now I am far. How will it know that? And how will it know it has found it? It could be an erroneous finding. It can find a solution, but it may not be the solution it is looking for. It can be some partial solution. There has to be something innate which already knows where to look, how close you are, and knows when you have found it. Isn't it? Otherwise you could not. And it is this power which is the truth mind within us. If it was not, the intellect could not be effective. Because of its presence, the intellect is effective. But increasingly the intellect can open to its direct action. So, it, the truth mind, is now representing this higher super mind. And the super mind is the divine way of knowing which includes everything, all knowledge. Something of that is in us as truth mind, therefore intellect knows what is right and what is not. And if this truth mind now begins to connect to its own source, it is capable of receiving all those illuminations, but in the terms needed for your mind to become aware and say, I know. If it was not present, what would happen? The gap between the higher domain and your mind's working would remain. And what would be the result of that? You could access things on the higher plane, by shutting down mind, or you could come back into mind and lose the higher knowledge. But you could not move across or link the two. Because something of that is present here as truth mind, it can receive the knowledge from above and form the linkage and the continuity between the two domains. And this is what Sri Aurobindo points to. Having explained this over the rest of the paragraph and the next paragraph, he will show how this link point is going to make possible everything which we have been discussing so far, and the means for this transition. And so the whole text has two angles. One, the insufficiency of the mind working without that higher support. And second, how that higher support in the mind is able to assist mind to fulfill all of these things. So he explains next, by the opposition of spirit and mind, without the free opening of this intermediate power, the two natures, and though there may be communication and influence, or the catching up of the lower into the higher in a sort of luminous or ecstatic trance, there cannot be a full and perfect transfiguration of the lower nature. So this is often the case in certain yogic systems where they seek to leap across from the mind to some higher state of consciousness, in a state of concentration. So there is a trance. It may be luminous, you're awake in a different state of consciousness, as for example when you have an exceptional state of sleep where you're awake, you're conscious, you're dreaming, and then you snap out, but there's no link between the two. Or it may be an ecstatic trance, you're so overwhelmed by the presence of the divine, it feels as if everything else falls apart, and then you snap out of it and it's gone. But the transfiguration of the lower, becoming perfect and full without limits, requires this link. So, in its absence, he says, we may feel imperfectly by the emotional mind, we may have a sense by the sense mind, or a conception and perception by the intelligent mind of the spirit present in matter and all its forms, the divine delight present in all emotion and sensation, the divine force behind all life activities. But the lower will still keep its own nature and limit and divide in its action and modify in its character the influence from above. Now recall what we had seen earlier of the work to be done in the physical forms of life. We have to begin to perceive as if they are molds, as if they are vehicles. We have to begin to perceive life itself as a channel for the divine energy, and in the emotions and in the sense mind we have to perceive that divine love and the universal delight, and in the power of the intellect and through the power of the intellect the working of this divine knowledge will. Now all of this, he says, we can begin to sense or glimpse. But when you cross, let's say, whatever you perceive, when it begins to enter more, the mind will continue to catch, break, and they will always limit. You can only perceive so much, beyond that the mind cannot, so it reduces to what it can. And everything will get reduced, divided in its action. What comes from above is essentially infinite. When it enters the mind, you will glimpse some sense of divinity, but it will cut it up into finiteness. So what's wrong with that, you may say? You may say, well, this is good, I'm at least having some glimpse, some experience of the divine, and maybe that's good enough, I'm happy with it. The problem with that is, in practice, it may lead to even greater discord. Let's say there are three of us, each perceiving the same experience or the same circumstance. Each has its, according to its mind, cuts the experience into its way, perceiving divinity in it, but in its particular form and manner. The result is each would say, this is divine in this way, in that way, in the other way. And there'll be a huge clash. Because according to how you perceive, you will want to act differently. This is really the problem of religions. Every religion has glimpsed an aspect of the divine, cut it up and taken that piece that it has glimpsed and declared it as the all. And so one religion has applied it to the whole of life, another religion has applied its principle to the whole of life, and the two collide massively in the whole of life. You see, it will lead to even bigger chaos, bigger division, because each principle it has caught is being actually applied everywhere. So Sri Aurobindo makes an observation about this, saying that he refers to it as over mental creation. It has a character of divinity, and its divinity can even have a sense of the infinite. But one will be so different from the other that there will be nothing in common between them. All you will end up will be islands, groups, subgroups. You will not be able to have a real divine unity working in diversity. And this becomes a serious problem when you see how today's religions are clashing against each other, to a degree where it even threatens human survival. Certain religions have declared, unless all of humanity is converted to their view, they cannot stop. And what happens when two of them take this stance? Well, they go on destroying each other. Within religions, having said, even if you say one religion catches one aspect, within religions, different subgroups catch different aspects, and each of those becomes exaggerated in its completeness, and they split. As you could imagine, suppose by some mischance, one of the religions did dominate the whole earth. Would there be peace? That's their promise. But in practice, no, because they would split. Because in their broader one aspect that they have got, inevitably somebody will look through it to another aspect, and one to another aspect, and the split would again take place, and again, and again. Swami Vivekananda makes this very interesting observation. The fulfillment of religions, he explains, I'm not quoting, but this is the idea. The fulfillment of religions, he explains, is when this kind of division goes to its extreme, where each human being has his own unique experience of the divine. And then it becomes spirituality. So interestingly, when you take it in mental terms, the breaking up of religions into an infinity of uniquenesses is spirituality. Or the transcending of religions beyond their narrow perspective to the large awakening to spirituality. See, just the individuals seeing their own experience would not be enough. You could still be locked into your experience and unable to see the continuum with the other viewpoints. It is only in the mind being liberated into the infinite which can now see all the viewpoints and still keep its own perspective. That would be the unity. So it is in this direction that he is pointing us. The lower will still keep its own nature and limit and divide in its action and modify in its character the influence from above. We will tend to distort to fit our expectations, our temperament, our need. If you go to the ocean, each one of us goes with a certain bowl to take water. Somebody goes with a hemispherical bowl and brings the water. Another goes with a tall vase, which is in the shape of a tube, brings his water. Another goes with a cubic squared shaped bowl. Each one will say the sea water is its shape. You see, as an analogy, because we are reducing it to our vehicle of container. we are missing the point that the water itself is infinite flow. And what we have caught is our container's limitation and not the nature of the water. And this is what happens in this. Even when the influence assumes its highest, widest, intensest power, it will be irregular and disorderly in activity and perfectly realized only in calm and stillness. So let's take the other extreme, where now that power is so strong it is able to overwhelm and somehow subdue all these limitations. What happens? In its very action, because it is overwhelming everything, you get destabilized. My senses are saturated, I am overwhelmed, I can't contain. My emotions are so full that I am unable to function normally. My mind is numbed, it is fragmented, or it's unable to think because it's too much what I'm seeing or experiencing. All the powers being pushed to their limit, you do not have a stable working. You don't know how to function in that condition. Or you can hold that stability only when you're completely still and calm. So when in that state of meditation you have this wonderful experience, you're able to hold something extraordinary, and then you start moving and enter activity of life, and everything either breaks or your movements are unstable. You are unable to contain that working, which is often the case in many yogic traditions, where they will refer to how some of the signs that somebody has reached an exceptional state of consciousness is precisely this instability. So often the instability is categorized as you behave like a child, or you behave like a madman, or you behave like a demon even. All abnormal behaviors. Why? Because the system cannot contain and cannot function as it is used to. Because there is no link point between that and this. We shall be subject to reactions and periods of obscuration when it is withdrawn from us. So suppose having come with full intensity, you have this extraordinary, in calm, contained experience. And when it withdraws, what happens? Everything is lost. And there is a darkness, there's a reaction within you, as if now the pressure is thrown off and suddenly a surging of all the things which were forced into calm, all those things rush up, and now the person behaves even more crazily. In the Tibetan Buddhism, they have a phrase called crazy wisdom. I don't know if you've seen that word. And the idea is, some of the masters, having great wisdom, are behaving in ways that to you normal human beings look crazy. But that craziness is actually backed by wisdom, so you should accept it and just follow what they say. And they will do crazy things, they will say crazy things, they will behave crazily. Unfortunately, that craziness is precisely this. It's a distortion, it's an instability, and the result is, in fact, it is ignorance masquerading as knowledge. The knowledge is there in some part, but the ignorance uses the cover of the knowledge to then dominate and do its thing. Your petty desires begin to take over, your ego satisfactions and drives take over and use the mask of the wisdom to assert themselves. And the result practically is, of course, disaster for themselves as well as for their disciples. We had recently one of those cases of an exceptional teacher, I think he was based in Australia, who suddenly many of his disciples began to out him as somebody who had put them through all kinds of not nice treatment and behavior, asked them to do things or behaved with them inappropriately, and then they all came out. And the poor man was in a shock. And he said something like, "Oh, I didn't know that you experienced it like that. I didn't know that you felt bad about it." He would humiliate people, he would abuse them sometimes, or he would things which were not acceptable in any normal human standard of or moral conduct. And he said, I didn't realize that you were suffering because of this. And it's obvious, but it was not obvious to him because within him there was that conflict and division. But this is the situation which would happen. And reactions, because if there has been a higher power subjugating the lower, but the lower has not changed fundamentally, then it allows, or it doesn't have a choice, it is subjugated. The moment you release the pressure, everything comes back. And the same person behaves in a very different way. In the ashram, we had a period in the late 20s when the mother was bringing down the over-mental creation. And it was a very intense period when she was creating the link between the over-mental gods and beings. And she had taken almost 2 years to build this, and the whole over-mental formation was ready and was being projected. These people were having exceptional experiences, extraordinary experiences. And the mother was containing, she was controlling the whole process, because she had that capacity and she could take it through to its completion. And one of the things which we have heard from and even had interviews with some of the people present who have now passed away, but we got them fortunately on tape. So one of them, apparently at that time, during the meditation session, he would suddenly get up, go over to somebody and whack him on the head. Or he would, as if throw off something from his back and say, oh, that's a scorpion, that's a scorpion. Strange behavior. And mother said, let him be. She asked people not to interrupt. Obviously, in that act of bringing something which is infinite into the finite vehicle, there was an instability. But mother had the capacity to bring it into stability and would have taken it through to completion. And at that point, when it was almost completed and the whole thing would have been fixed into the physical, she went to Sri Aurobindo and showed the stage to which it had been brought. And then Sri Aurobindo made an observation. He said, it will create the world's greatest religion, but we will have to postpone the short-term benefit for the long-term. And mother says, she went back and dissolved the whole thing within 2 hours. Now, it's not that over 2 years Sri Aurobindo didn't know what was happening. They were working together to make this happen. But having reached this point, they recognized that there would be certain benefits, but there would be disadvantages which would even delay the greater supramental working. Because humanity would catch this form, the magical powers that the people had now begun to develop or express, and it would lock itself into that, refusing to go further precisely because of its dramatic character. And having brought it to this point, they saw that it was a shortcut which would delay the longer term objective, which was to bring down the supramental power. One of the things which it would have done was, because of the nature of the overmental consciousness, there would have been these exceptional groupings, distinct facets of the experience, but none seeing eye to eye, and so on. When mother dissolved it, for many of these people the experiences stopped. For some it was abrupt, for some it just faded out. Of some of them, mother made this comment because of the link that had once been made, the person still had the stamp of that particular character and so on. One of these persons we had opportunity to interview. He was afterwards a bit odd. He was always odd. And perhaps he was always odd even from the beginning. But they started with what they had, the material they had. So when we interviewed him, he said, I was becoming so powerful. I was becoming so great. I was becoming greater than mother. And she got jealous and she took away my power. And when he was saying it, I thought to myself, wow. He was becoming greater than mother, and yet mother had the power to take away his experience. What do you make of that? He couldn't see logically the contradiction of his thinking. But you can see how the ego seized upon those experiences and made it its own. And you can understand why the mother and Sri Aurobindo insisted on the psychic transformation first. If that same person had gone through the freedom from the personal ego in a deeper psychic awakening, being conscious of the soul's relationship with the divine, the same imprint of the consciousness, of that higher consciousness, would not have given this warped form. As was the case with a few other sadhaks who had that deeper awakening, and they didn't turn it around and say, oh, we were greater than mother. They saw it as something which was given as a gift, and whatever remained of it, they built upon. But where the ego was not freed, it seized, and you see how it perverts the whole thing. Now, all of these are examples to look at, and I think every tradition has descriptions of what happens when that withdraws and there is this reaction or the obscuration and the ego distorting things. Now, obscurations we can still see as a part of a normal spiritual transition. There is a period when there is an experience, and then for various reasons the experience has to withdraw because certain parts are not active during the experience, and now they need to get back into activity for the experience to be able to touch them the next time. But when that experience withdraws, suddenly everything is gone. And if you are not careful enough, you can easily say, I have lost it. And Mother was careful to remind us that you have not lost it. The experience recedes, but you have not lost it. It's waiting for you to prepare a clearer base in which it can again come back more completely. And if we take it in this spirit, we know what to do to work during that period. So, we shall be subject to reactions and periods of obscuration when it is withdrawn from us. Precisely because it is withdrawn, nothing of it is present here. But if something of it was present and active, even when it withdraws, you would never lose the link. You see, this is the point of this link. We shall be apt to forget it in the stress of ordinary life and its outward touches and the siege of its dualities, and to be fully possessed of it only when alone with ourselves and God, or else in moments of periods of a heightened exaltation and ecstasy. So 3 types of relation. First is when you are under pressure of ordinary life and its outward touches and the siege of its dualities, you will tend to forget. Why? Because I am so engaged with what I am doing in my normal vehicles of thought, emotion and action, in their normal working, and the experience was happening in some other part of my mind or emotions or body, which are not engaged during the experience, and those parts which are in the experience are not engaged when I am active. This is the division in our own consciousness. The split which is above and below reflects within us in a split in the parts which have it, parts which don't have it. And mostly in our normal life, when we are fully engaged with our senses or with our mind, those are the parts, what Sri Aurobindo calls the dynamic parts, the parts in activity. Those are the ones least touched when we receive an experience in a state of quiet, in stillness, calm or silence. Because those parts were inactive, they don't receive. You move into activity, the parts which have not received are now in front, the parts which have received are behind. There's a split, there's a division. This is one state. The second is fully possessed of it only when alone with ourselves and God. So you go back to your calm, inner silence, withdrawn, and you get back into that poise. Now what happens in a life like this? When I lose myself in work, I lose everything. I go back into my silence and isolation and I regain everything. What will happen? Very quickly, you will not want to get into normal life. You will not want to engage with people or with things. You would become more and more a recluse, and this is what happened with the ascetic traditions. But the same ascetic who has it all in his state of retirement and withdrawal, the moment he is challenged by life, will lose that poise and behave in a very crude or coarse or unbalanced way. So there is no possibility of divine life. There is divine, there is life, but the two never meet. Or the third, he describes, or else in moments or periods of a heightened exaltation and ecstasy. Something enters, something fills, and there's a heightened state. During that time, you are able to do everything from that higher consciousness, and then it withdraws, and poof, you're back to what you were. The things which make us forget, he uses certain phrases. We are apt to forget it in the stress of ordinary life and its outward touches and the siege of its dualities. These three things, it's worth observing. What is the mechanism which makes us forget? If we are conscious of it, we can also make corrections. So first he speaks of stress of ordinary life. Suppose your normal life was very calm, relaxed, not demanding much. Let's say I am sitting and sewing a beautiful pattern on a large piece of cloth, a project that's going to take me several months. And I've just come back from the darshan with the mother. She blessed me, I'm full of that presence. I go to my work and I start sewing. It's easy to let the finger go on mechanically while your heart and mind are immersed in the joy and the uplifted state of consciousness. We had many in the ashram who had that kind of work, and mother allocated that work because for reasons which were obviously their best way of growth. Now suppose tomorrow the boss comes and says, hey, you're going too slow. You can't finish this over 8 months. You must finish it in 1 week. Now you see the stress that comes into you. I have to go faster, I have to do this. Am I meeting my deadlines? And every 1 hour you check, am I going fast enough? And the fellow comes and rattles you again and again. You're still too slow, speed up, speed up. And you see what it does? It destabilizes you emotionally, sensorily, intellectually. Not only you will make mistakes, but that poise of calm in which you held what was received is broken. The first thing that stress does, it excites, it agitates your consciousness. And you have no other capacity to hold what came. It's easy to hold in a base of calm, it's difficult to hold in a base that is agitated. The first training in any spiritual life is establish that calm in which you can reflect a higher consciousness. You break the calm and it's gone. All of modern life today is pressing us into this stressed condition. Very few jobs remain where you can actually have a calm, relaxed life. So people seek that sometimes. We see a lot of people having retired from their stressed lives, they will say, oh, now I want to spend some time in the ashram or in some center or some spiritual space where I can pursue that in a state of calm. And mother's first response to such people was, at that time she said, I'm sorry, the ashram is not a place for retirement. You must be willing to take on the whole of life head on, otherwise please don't come here. For retirement you can go to retirement homes and other traditions where that state is acceptable. So it's actually required of us that even in the most extreme stress, one should be able to retain that link. Now how will that happen? Only if something in you is already that, or is able to link to that while the rest of you is stressed. But it should be something which is able to be active in life, not something which is only there in passivity. So this is first point which breaks the link. The second, he says, it's outward touches. Now what is outward touch and inward touch? when you read, let's say when you're watching a movie, you observe the effect that the movie has on you. You listen to music, observe the effect that the music has on you. You read a book, observe the effect it has. You interact with people, observe the effect. You'll find very quickly there are two kinds of effect. There is an effect where you find yourself pulled more and more into your external layers, and there's an effect which is of you more and more turning to your internal layers. Let's say in a conversation, you're having with somebody, and the person speaks of the things which excite you. Or what is your favorite food and how does that taste, how do you make it? Now all of your senses are turning outwards to the sense and the first contact of the senses, taste, smell, touch. The same conversation may shift. When you eat the food, what do you feel? And what do you feel about the fact that you feel happy or content? What are the things which make you content? What are the things which make you happy? Can you recall a time when you felt calm and happy and it lasted a long time? Now the whole conversation is shifting to an internal awareness. Every activity, every engagement in life will have things which touch the inner, things which touch the outer. Some things will pull you more outward, some things will pull you more inward. Observe. Simply observing, and you will find you will begin to select, avoid or encourage certain things more because of your priorities, your values. I have watched in certain spaces, in certain countries where the excitation is more valued. I've watched people walking on the road with things in their ears, listening to music. The head is going like that, in the rhythm of the beat of the music. Now if you observe the body, every part of the body is moving. The fellow is standing at a traffic light and legs, hands. His walking has become now somehow rhythmic to the music. He cannot control himself, he is not even aware. And his entire system has been exteriorized to this music and a state of excitation of the music. Now if you take out the music, suddenly the fellow will be, I don't know what to do with my life. It's boring. Give me something to excite me. He'll look around, he'll become restless, he'll become unstable. I had a taxi driver once in New York. He was to take me to the airport and he had the radio on. It was low enough that you couldn't make out too much. It had meaningless chatter. And I told him, can you please switch it off? He switched off. After about 2 minutes, he became extremely restless. He said, I find this silence oppressive. I can't stand it. I can't stand this silence. I need some noise. I said, yeah, but if you don't mind, I find it a little intrusive. So finally he rolled down the window slightly, so the hiss of the air was making the sound. And then he felt relief. He needed to cling to something which was externalizing him. Because the moment the silence came, it turned him inward, he was afraid. Now imagine a person has been so locked into this, he has no sense or no ability to go in. And you have the reverse, people who are so deeply interiorized that to get pulled too much is uncomfortable. Literally you could divide humanity into two on this basis. Those who are more inwardly centered or aware, and those who are totally unaware inwardly and are embedded and fixed in the outer. You can split humanity into two groups and you can see where they will go. Of course, one can transition from one to the other. And so much of the modern life is designed to exteriorize you. From morning to evening, children are being made to be exteriorized, made to be excited, made to turn outward, taught not to turn in, not to become aware of what's happening inside. They're never given a chance, and it's by design. There's an intention there to divert humanity into a different direction. But this is what's happening. The second thing of life, outward touches. And they are outward, they draw you outward. The same thing could be reversed. A touch could bring you inward. Ideally, as far as the integral yoga is concerned, we would want to be able to develop both. There are two different parts of our universe, of our life, the outward turn and the inward turn, and we should be able to move back and forth across these two until they're seamlessly bridged. This should be the nature of the training. So again, the correction for this will be, when you find yourself in an outward turn, if you're conscious, you can compensate for it with an inward turn, or an inward awareness kept during the outward turn. Or having made the outward exploration, you come back to make a correction. And you go back and forth consciously. The third thing which he is describing is the siege of its dualities. Now this word siege is suggestive. When a fort is refusing to give up, it is surrounded by an army which cannot get in. The fort is too strong. It surrounds the fort, prevents anything from going in or anything from coming out. This is siege. When Sri Aurobindo is using this word, it has a very clear idea here. Similar to this description, that which is within is too strong. Life can push all it wants, but finally, the self and the soul are too strong. The divine can never be overwhelmed by something which is fragmented. That which is infinite can never be overwhelmed by that which is finite. That which is timeless can never be broken by any activity of time. But what it can do is it can surround it, prevent its influences from coming out. And it can create such a strong surrounding layer that you will only see the surrounding layer and you will forget that there is this thing within. So when he speaks of the siege of life's dualities, the dualities have so tightly surrounded the inner divine presence, which is not of dualities, which is of unity. But the dualities have so tightly surrounded that we have the illusion that there is only duality. And this is the error which we have all grown into. Happiness, sadness, pleasure, pain, and so on, hot and cold. When we are young, we are more elastic. We can swing between them. As we grow older, our vitality weakens or our biology cannot support too much variation and the thing simply narrows. I recall one of the persons I had visited once in the nursing home, and she had a fan above her bed and she said, "Can you turn it up?" So we turned it up. "No, that's too much. Reduce it." We turned it down. "No, that's too little. Turn it up a little." Back and forth. Until, now it's perfect. Leave it. Wow. She had been at it for so long, living in that bed with that fan, that now it had narrowed to that bit. And I knew, okay, her time's up. When it narrows so much that no more place anywhere for flexibility, then pretty much the consciousness is withdrawing or is being pushed out. The very nature of the youth is this ability to fluidly move in a wider range. When the range narrows too much, that's aging. Push back and you find that's flexibility. But this sense of duality is so replete that we've forgotten that there is something within us which is not dual. That behind that happiness and sadness, there is something which is just interested to be and to even enjoy the happiness or sadness as, that's interesting experience. And we've forgotten it's there because of the tight siege. And it is this siege which makes us forget. Now what's the correction for this? And this is a little more tricky. It requires a bit more skill, but we can develop that. In the midst of the happiness, rather than exulting in the happiness and saying, "I am so happy," you step back from the happiness and turn and remember the divine. Offer the happiness and share the happiness with the divine. "Oh, I'm so happy. What a beautiful experience. Thank you for this." And you link to that. Do not enjoy the happiness by yourself, not the bird eating the fruit and being obsessed with the fruit, but turning up to the source, which is the true enjoyer, and offering and sharing this. It doesn't mean you don't enjoy, but you share your enjoyment, you give your enjoyment. It's not lost, it only becomes more beautiful and somehow more refined, more free. But the same with the other. Now I'm unhappy. Everything seems to be glum, dark, I see no hope, somehow I feel a bit low. Oh, this is an interesting experience. Here, Divine Mother, I open it to you, I offer it to you, and share it. It's not particularly pleasant, but okay, if it's serving a purpose, I share it. And in the same spirit of sharing the happiness, you give this. And if you can do it to both, very quickly you will find that the thing which is offering is somehow immune to both, and somehow is able to even enjoy the both as different colors or shades of some one color, and not bound to either. And this will free you from the illusion of the siege and awaken you to that which is deeper inside, and many more possibilities begin to grow. But just this simple psychological exercise will disengage and free you from the siege. So we reread the sentence, you see what he is capturing in just a few words. We shall be apt to forget it in the stress of ordinary life and its outward touches and the siege of its dualities. Just one phrase has covered such a wide range of insights. And to be fully possessed of it only when alone with ourselves and God. You will recall this phrasing, alone with ourselves and with God. It reminds you of the line in Savitri, where Sri Aurobindo uses the same phrase. He says, in moments when the inner lamps are lit and life's cherished guests are left outside, our spirit sits alone and speaks to its gulfs. Life's cherished guests are left outside and the inner lamps are lit. The symbol you can catch. The inner awareness and the aspiration, the lamps, and the cherished guests, all the things which you enjoy of life, which are precisely turning you outward, forgetting what's within. Well, you say, okay, that's your space, now you stay out, I go in. Doesn't mean you abandon them, you will get them back, but you keep the guests out and then go in. And our spirit sits alone and speaks to its gulfs. And there's a very interesting suggestion here. It's not like you're alone with something else. You see this phrasing, alone with ourselves and God. Well, God is someone else. That's one way of looking at it. Or you can say, your own deeper ranges, your own completenesses, your own divinity. And it's into yourself that you go as you dwell in the divine presence. Or else, only in moments or periods of a heightened exaltation and ecstasy. And so this gap remains. For our mentality, a restricted instrument, moving in a limited field and seizing things by fragments and parcels, is necessarily shifting. Our mentality is necessarily shifting, restless, and mutable. So this very precise and complete description of the problem of the mind. First, that it is an instrument which is restricted. The working of mind itself is a narrow band. It cannot, for example, understand emotions, right? Emotions are not rational. People who live much more in their thought, they look at their emotions and say, well, why are my emotions messing up my life? I would rather live by just this rational thinking. It's a very narrow band of experience as an instrument. It can only act on thoughts. It cannot act on energies. It cannot act on emotions. It cannot even act on matter. It can only act on the emotions to act on the body to act on matter. But directly the mind can do nothing. Let's say you are only a brain, you knock out everything else in the body, paralyzed from the neck down. What can your mind do? You have the example of Stephen Hawking, and even he had to initially use the best working of the eyes to point to letters to be able to communicate something. Otherwise, what can the mind do? Think with ideas, and then what? Nothing. Produce ideas, and they act in the domain of thought only. That's it. Narrow band. Restricted instrument, moving in a limited field of the mind and thought only, and seizing things by fragments and parcels. So I catch one petal at a time, and then I combine the petals to form a flower, and then I combine the flowers to create a garland. So that's the parcels. A parcel is a combination of pieces. But otherwise it can only take pieces and then combine. And so this instrument is necessarily shifting, restless and mutable. Why necessarily? Because it's managing pieces only. And when it manages pieces, having got a few pieces, it has to add more pieces, and the moment you add more pieces, somehow the picture changes. And every time you add more pieces, you package them differently, the picture changes. So the whole working of the mind is always shifting. When it stops shifting, it gets restless, because it knows there are more pieces and it's not getting to them. So it needs to now do something. So shifting, restless, and finally, as it keeps on doing, it changes. Its states change, its viewpoint changes. Once I saw things from this way, now I see things from this way. Earlier I would see things as a young man looking towards life, now I see it as an old man looking back at life, and the whole perspective is totally different. But every time, in every way, things are mutable, changing. What can you do to get steadiness? And here's the interesting insight he gives, deep in the psychology of the mind. It can find steadiness only by limiting its field of action, and fixity only by cessation and repose. You want your mind to be steady, you want your mind to have fixity. Well, here's the solution. For a steady mind, limit its field of action. Make the field narrow enough that you're going on and on in the same track. And you'll say, my life is now stable and steady. The moment the field widens and more things come in and the complexity grows, the instability, unsteadiness, they begin to increase. Field of action, narrow it down. Become a specialist in the field of knowledge. You see, a professor specializes in a very narrow field, and he's stable in it. The moment you widen the field, too many things are happening everywhere, my knowledge is always in a flux, cannot have stability. Specialist in action. My job is to push the paper from this table to the next by filling out this form. You have a stable life. You're secure. But the moment you're responsible for the entire project and all the instabilities which come with it and the uncertainties, you're in high stress, high tension. It's very interesting to see how this works in the domain of, in the hierarchy of a job. When you're way down in the job, you're secure because your work is so narrow. And if things go wrong, it's not your problem, it's the fellows who are looking after your problem who have to supply you your material, and you can be almost like a little piece in a machine. Very simple life. You get popped up a little bit, what they call middle management, then you have all the stresses, because at that point you are responsible for the problems of things not working. You are responsible for deadlines. You go higher up, interestingly, you also have more stability, because your job is to ensure that the middle management does its job and nothing else. You only keep kicking them. They are responsible for the outcome. You only have to keep nudging them. You again come back to some kind of a narrowness. But the moment you narrow, you limit your field of action, things become stable. But would you be happy in it? That's a different story. Innately, our spirit is unhappy in something too narrow or too restrictive, unless that's your current phase of evolution. And there are large parts of humanity which are still in that. Sri Aurobindo makes an observation that in the very scheme of nature and the organization and the way she makes human types, the largest number are those who are more stable in the physical mind. That's the largest number that she ensures. But that is when she wants to keep a civilization stable. So those who are more in the abstract thought, visioning the future, wanting to progress rapidly, they are fewer, and they are in the top part. They vision the future, and gradually it percolates down to the lowest levels of society, where small changes are introduced over time, and so you have a stable society. But imagine what would happen if nature shifts the balance, and there are more people now visioning the future, less people satisfied with stable mechanical or simple lives. Immediately you'll have a revolution. So nature is playing with the balance of who is where in the majority, and by playing with this, she is actually leading revolutions. And you can sometimes anticipate here, we have a large number of young people. This is true in India and China right now. Something like 75% of the population is below 30 or 34, something like that. They're still too young, bulk of them. Below 25 is 50% of the population. Imagine when that 50% moves into the age group of 20 to 30. A lot of life energy, wanting to do things, wanting to experiment, to conquer. Poof, you'll have a revolution. And you can anticipate it just by looking at the population pattern. We're not even looking at types of humanity. If you look at the types and their arrangement that nature has made, you can again anticipate what kind of revolution, which direction will it go. But I was pointing to the steadiness. When you have limited field of action, you have the sense of steadiness, but something inside you is restless. You need to broaden. So generally what happens in our life, we find stability, we get restless, we widen a little more until it becomes stable, and then a little more. Too unstable, well, narrow it back. Find your balance and gradually, slowly widen. That's the slow pace of evolution. The other interesting point makes fixity. How do you have a fixed mind? Cessation and repose. Make your mind calm, quiet, stop the activity and your mind is fixed. It seems so obvious. The moment your mind starts active, well, it won't be fixed, it will keep moving. But this is true of the mind, it's not true of body, for example. The body can have fixity also in activity. I can be doing a mechanical activity and still be fixed in my consciousness, or in the emotions similarly. But for the mind, the only way you can be fixed is if you stop doing things. So he's going deep into the very nature of the psychology of mind. Steadiness and fixity are therefore impossible if you want to grow and if you want to work for the mind. At least that's how it is formed currently. When this same mind now becomes suffused with the light of the higher light, force and joy of Satchidananda, it can experience that fixity without stopping in the peace that settles from above. And the mind can be in activity while still being founded in this stability of peace. And it can widen its activity in the light without losing itself in the complexity that comes with the wideness. Peace and light descending from above can give to the mind fixity and steadiness while in dynamic activity of life. So this is what Sri Aurobindo has shown us. What is the problem with the mind when it has not got this link principle? On the other hand, he says, when that linking principle is active, everything changes. What happens? Our direct truth perceptions, on the other hand, come from that supermind. A will that knows and a knowledge that effects. which creates universal order out of infinity. Its awakening into action brings down, says the Veda, the unrestricted downpour of the rain of heaven, the full flowing of the 7 rivers from a superior sea of light and power and joy. It reveals Satchidananda, it reveals the truth behind the scattered and ill-combined suggestions of our mentality, and makes each to fall into its place in the unity of the truth behind. Thus it can transform the half-light of our minds into a certain totality of light. It reveals the will behind all the devious and imperfect and regulated strivings of our mental will and emotional wishes and vital effort, and makes each to fall into its place in the unity of the luminous will behind. Thus it will transform the half-obscure struggle of our life and mind into a certain totality of ordered force. It reveals the delight for which each of our sensations and emotions is groping, and from which they will fall back in movements of partially grasped satisfaction or of dissatisfaction, pain, grief, or indifference, and make each take its place in the unity of the universal delight behind. Thus, it can transform the conflict of our dualized emotions and sensations into a certain totality of serene, yet profound and powerful love and delight. And then in the universal vision, it will show us how everything is connected in the larger oneness. Now, I've just quickly read through and look at the summary of it because this needs a fuller exploration for next Friday. But what he's showing us is the moment that direct truth perception begins to work, it will not only reveal the Satchidananda because it's the linking point, but it will show how in your working of the mind, every piece of the mind's zigzagging, like the ant, every piece of its working had behind it something of the truth which it was reflecting. And when you see every piece reflecting a piece of the truth, and you see the truth behind that it's reflecting, well, all the pieces fall into place. You see, it's like a jigsaw puzzle. Each piece you see has a picture. Now you know it's a part of the whole, but you don't know what is the whole. The moment someone places before you the whole, you can see, this fits there, this fits there, this fits there. Everything spontaneously falls into the picture. And this is what that principle is doing. The direct truth perception shows you the full picture, and suddenly all this complex, fragmented working of your mind is revealed to be actually pieces, each reflecting a piece of the truth, and immediately they fall into place. And the mind sees, wow. And the same thing happens with the will. Behind the devious, imperfectly regulated strivings of what? Your mental will, your emotional wishes, your vital efforts, everything is pulling, pushing in different directions, almost chaotically. And you see, behind it all, there was one divine will, of which these were catching pieces. How often does it happen to you that you know you must do this, but you know also some part of you says you must do this also. And then there's the third part which says, yeah, but what about that? I don't want to neglect this either. What do? You cannot. You get split. You have to compromise one for the other or some of these. But if you saw the will behind, one divine will, you would recognize what this piece represents from there, what that piece represents, what the other piece represents. And when you see the full picture of what that will intends, all these pieces will fall into spontaneous harmony. And you see what was intended, and you'll be able to flow through, navigate without compromise, without needing to be broken. And the same for the delight. Our sensations and emotions are trying to grasp, to get satisfaction, they get dissatisfaction, they gain pain, grief, indifference, all these things which we're trying to catch, which are driving us. Each, you will see, piece of that experience, what it represents in the delight that is behind, what it's nourishing you with, and suddenly everything falls into a continuum on the basis of that delight. And all this in a consciousness which is wide and universal, you see the big picture of everything. And how all this of your personal life weaves into and perfectly blends into the larger picture of the larger collective movement and where it's all going. And everything falls into harmony because that which is behind is harmonious, and that is revealed by the working of this direct truth perception. Now, see what happened when it was not there. What happened to the mind, what happened to the emotions, what happened to our senses, how things became haphazard and fragmented. Now bring that principle of the direct truth perception and see how it links with what is behind and spontaneously brings all this order. Now you see why this truth perception is so important. Why Sri Aurobindo said earlier that all of this transformation cannot be completed, cannot be really executed without awakening the truth mind. And when the truth mind is awakened, then all of this becomes almost spontaneous, almost effortless, because it links with that which is already what we are seeking. And things fall into place. In between, he has described the character of this truth consciousness and what happens when it is awakened through the symbolism of the Veda. And when he points to something like that, it's an important indication, and we need to explore what that is. He describes this truth perception as a will that knows and a knowledge that effects. You see, the will and knowledge are united. But we'll explore how this works. And the way we will understand this truth perception or the truth mind is through our experiences of intuition. All of us have had that. Even when we are not conscious of it, it's the intuition which is finally leading everything. When we are conscious of it, then at least we appreciate how effective it is. But we will look at a few examples of how that works to appreciate will that knows and also to appreciate knowledge that effects. They're slightly different aspects of the experience. But then, how that leads to creating a universal order out of infinity, and what this means, bringing down the unrestricted downpour of the rain of heaven, the full flowing of 7 rivers, etc. These are important symbols, but they are also symbols which correspond to something in our experience. And even if our experience is a glimpse of it, that glimpse is the starting point of a larger opening. So we will explore all that next Friday, and then review how this presence awakes in our mentality the perception of the one truth behind, and how the pieces fall into place, and how the will also similarly gets unified, and how the delight and the enjoyment also is unified. And then the whole thing universalized. So this is the next paragraph, discusses the working of this truth perception as it enters our life. Keep in mind always that this is not something which happens in one go. And the descriptions we will read, although they describe the full movement, they also capture stages of that movement. And the first few stages are within our reach in our consciousness as we are. Just as that dog is ready for a conscious, developed, rational intelligence, we as human beings are ready for a conscious, developed truth mind to be awakened. In fact, it is already working in us. That's why we feel the need for this higher possibility. That's why to read about it, to understand its working, and to see how it has worked through the intuition is so interesting for us. That it is interesting is a sign that the need within us is already pointing there. When a person is not ready for it, there will be nice ideas, but they will not be interesting. When we are ready for it, whether you use this vocabulary or some other vocabulary, it is this one thing which you will find most interesting, fascinating, and the one thing which gives you satisfaction. So the fact that we are here, that we are reading this, and Sri Aurobindo's description is so interesting, is itself the promise that we are ready for it. And then as we read, we will see all the fine nuances and stages that he will show for this further conscious development of the truth mind or truth perception becoming more and more direct. So we pause here and we can take up any comments or questions. Okay. Yes. That is. Thank you.
What is for you rational intelligence?
The question is, what is rational intelligence for me? For me. Okay. I will, you cannot get a more complete description than Sri Aurobindo telling you how the rational intelligence works or what it represents, what is its truth. And so I'm going to read. I know. Still. So Sri Aurobindo describes it like this: the characteristic energy of pure mind is change. And the more it acquires elevation and organization, the more this law of mind assumes the aspect of continual enlargement, improvement, and better arrangement of its gains. And so of a continual passage from a smaller and simpler to a larger and more complex perfection. Boom, it captures the whole working of the mind's deepest impulse and law. And because this is there in us, we keep growing, always towards perfection. And then he says, the nature of the mind, which is what makes for this law. For mind, unlike bodily life, is infinite in its field. You can think of everything. Its field is infinite. Elastic in its expansion, easily variable in its formations. Change, then self-enlargement and self-improvement are its proper instincts. Its faith is perfectibility, its watchword is progress. So deepest faith in our mind is that it can be made better. It can be made perfect. That is the deepest. And you're fulfilling mind only if you're progressing. If you don't progress, your mind feels it's not fulfilling itself. So this catches it so perfectly that you cannot find a better description. What is it for me is... Yes. 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 Similarly, he describes in that passage the characteristic energy of bodily life and then the characteristic law of spirit. And so these three together, it's very interesting for those of you who want to read this. It's all part of the chapter called The Threefold Life. Chapter 3 of the Synthesis of Yoga. It's worth rereading.
And my question is, you spoke about Mother bringing down the over-mental creation and linking the sadhaks with the gods and then stopping it. Mm-hmm. So I have and then in your other talks you speak about the Kena Upanishad and the Vedic gods that we are supposed to invoke. Mm-hmm. And then there are the 4 personalities of the Mother that we are also... So I don't understand why she stopped it actually, and if those gods are part of the overmental creation or not, whether the four personalities are or whether they are in between.
So there is a very important distinction between the Vedic yoga and Sri Aurobindo's integral yoga. There are many common features. This movement of ascent and descent, for example, is a key principle. The idea of a transformation of life is a key principle. The idea of perfection and the full awakening to the infinity of the Satchidananda in life, etc., are all common features. But in the method used, there is a significant difference. In the Vedic yoga, one, because of the nature of the human evolution then, one related to the various powers, the gods, so to say, as cosmic universal powers, one related to them and worked to invoke their working in us, to perfect their working by a movement, a double movement of invocation as well as a surrender. And then there's a sequence by which they organize themselves, and so the evolutionary process, which normally takes, let's say, 1,000,000 years, and the same sequence is now shortened and made into a lifetime. In the way it had to be done, there were always the struggles of harmonizing these different powers and working on them and their differences. But in the integral yoga, the framework is different in that we do not relate to these gods, even as cosmic powers. We relate directly to their source in the oneness of the Divine Mother and her Shakti, of whom they are children, of whom they are specialized aspects. So in that sense, we invoke directly the one Divine Mother, invoke her action in us. As she deploys the different aspects of her working, we may recognize these as those gods. You see, the working of the divine mind in us, we will, as that awakens, and that's the passage really we're working at now, as that power begins to awaken, it will be Indra in that higher working. We may or may not recognize it in that way, or we may simply see the working of the divine Shakti in the power of the working of the truth mind growing. And so, rather than us struggling with different aspects and then harmonizing them, we work on one action which has multiple movements. She works to harmonize them, and there is a higher wisdom which leads the whole process. And then it does not matter whether we even distinguish between these secondary powers. Yes. So in the nature of the integral yoga, there is one focus, but that one focus has a multidimensional working, and it makes the process much simpler. So we have come to the most important part now of the working of the truth perception. And as we observe the fine nuances and steps of this working, we will also see how this can be articulated into daily practices, as we have done for the other things so far. What are the ways by which we can correct for the stress of ordinary life, for the outward touches and the siege of dualities? Once we are conscious that it's there, we know what to do to correct for it. And when we put these little practices into our daily routine, it starts changing things very quickly. As long as we have lived by a kind of a mechanical hypnosis, we were victim of the processes of nature. The moment we become conscious, and that's what Sri Aurobindo is doing, and minutely we become conscious of all the little devices and means, we are able to now turn them around and make them means for our growth rather than means for entrapment. And the whole balance changes. You could read the same text as an exercise of futility, saying, that's how nature works, we are trapped. Or you could turn it around and say, this is how nature works, now we know how to make use of this device for our own conscious progress. And the same thing we turn into our means for rapid evolution. So we'll continue this text next Friday. Mhm. Okay, her question is how to manage that borderline between asceticism and the demand of life. Very simply, first become conscious of where that line is. Find out what in you shrinks, what in you seeks. Just becoming conscious. And this background of what Sri Aurobindo has made us aware of, and the importance of the need to bridge, will itself begin to work, and you will find gradually things harmonizing. But first is to become conscious. As long as you're unaware of what shrinks in you or what seeks in you instinctively, you remain a victim. And that's why this minute mapping. You could say, why worry about all this? Just follow a basic practice and the rest will happen. No, it's not so. Because the very working of the integral yoga is a transformation into all the fine details. And it requires us to become conscious of those fine details eventually. If not now, then later. But if they have been mapped out from the beginning and the means to deal with them have been already shown, then as that one overall movement grows and these things come up, we deal with them.